testing sound for the YouTube video. Testing. All right, how's that? Okay, welcome everyone to our Skills First in Lockdown webinar this morning. Hopefully everyone's had their morning coffees and are ready to get stuck into some Skills First contractual compliance. Thank you first of all to everyone for joining us this morning, and also to Accelerate for putting in all the efforts behind the scenes to get us up and running with this live stream this morning. The webinar will be recorded and made available through our YouTube channel at the end of this as well. My name's Chris and I'll be your presenter this morning. I just wanted to start the webinar by saying how blown away we are by the number of registrations that we've had in this webinar. I'm sure not everyone will be able to make it to the live stream, but we did have 175 participants register for the webinar this morning. So hopefully the IT stacks up. And we had those people representing 104 different organisations. And just to put that into perspective, that's about 30% of all contracted Skills First providers across the industry. So absolutely blown away by those figures. And I think it says a lot about what's on people's minds at the moment in our sector, particularly obviously in Victoria. Today's agenda is really 5 main sort of sections, and I'm going to do my best to keep this to 45 minutes because I know we're all very busy during this period. So we want to focus on the challenges that are currently being presented to Skills First providers, as well as in the now, as well as what future challenges we might want to expect. We're going to focus a little bit on online delivery, as well as enrolment processes, so ways that we can streamline our pre-training review, eligibility and enrolment processes. How we can engage with students and manage student progress remotely, specifically talking about evidence of participation. And then finally, touching briefly on our favourite topic, data reporting, and the impacts that might have on your cash flow as a contracted RTO. So starting with the challenges of COVID-19. And there's a lot of them. And we've just highlighted a few in this webinar. And I just want to say that we're probably not going to do any specific topic justice today, just because of the time limitation. We could probably talk for 8 hours on Skills First, but we are hoping that this webinar will give you a starting point to start to think about some other things that you may not have thought about in your organisation. So some of the challenges that we're faced with at the moment, obviously the big one is the ability to conduct face-to-face training. For some organisations that's more important than others, depending on what qualifications and delivery and assessment structure you've got in place. But it's a really difficult one because obviously without that face-to-face engagement, a lot of cohorts lose motivation very quickly. We also have to extend end dates potentially for units of competency, which as we know can have severe impacts on cash flow. And also perhaps we might have some idle training staff who may not really know where their place is at the moment without that ability to conduct face-to-face training. It's also become a lot harder for us to provide student support in those traditional means. And a lot of providers have said to us recently that they've started to lose touch with their cohorts, even though they are trying to implement remote engagement strategies. There's also an enormous technological capacity and capability challenge. Depending on the sophistication of your organization's systems, a lot of organizations have a lack of technology pre-COVID, a lack of understanding perhaps on how to determine whether or not a piece of technology is going to do what you need it to do. And also not to mention the time and money cost associated with adopting technology. Compliance never goes away, and we always have that compliance challenge sitting in front of us. And so we're juggling a lot of balls at the moment. I want to touch briefly on mental health as well, because I think it's something that our industry perhaps hasn't quite come to terms with or hasn't recognised completely just how prevalent this is going to be as an issue over the coming months or years as well. Speaking of mental health, if we look at the isolated cohort, for example, so study provides purpose and direction for many students, and students, as I mentioned before, can lose focus if disengaged. Quite often, RTOs, whether they're a community-based provider, a TAFE, or a private RTO, become a safe house for many cohorts. It becomes a home away from home, or a second home, if you like. And those students have lost that, and they're now isolated in their homes. A lot of uncertainty around whether or not they can come back into the classroom and socialise with their classmates. And that uncertainty can also lead to depression as well. An isolated workforce is also something that we should consider. So huge concerns amongst workers in the vet sector around job security. There was an article in the AFR the other day that mentioned there were about 38,000 teacher jobs lost or furloughed in Victoria, in the country, sorry. And a lot of these staff members of your organisations are being asked to rapidly adopt technology, and not only rapidly adopt technology which may put them outside their comfort zone, but also to then go and support learner cohorts in how to utilise that technology as well, which is a challenge for many. And we also need to appreciate that working from home is not always ideal for everybody. Home environments are different. Not everyone has the luxury of a home office. Kids change the dynamics massively. Behind my screen, my banner behind me is probably 2 screaming kids at the moment. Then there's also the staff members that live alone, and the impacts that might have, not being able to leave the house or come into a workplace and socialise with people, not to mention the financial challenges as well. And I think it's really important that we recognise this, because if we can't, if our workforce is isolated and struggling mentally, we can't expect them to then go and support our cohorts effectively. I want to talk about creating an engagement strategy. So I think it's really important that RTOs, particularly contracted RTOs, develop an engagement strategy if you haven't already. It's critical to your long-term success. And you need to be able to identify the strategies for engaging with learners, industry, and other key stakeholders. Okay, we've gone from having this, in many cases, an office environment where we can just tap a person on the shoulder and talk to them, to having an isolated, decentralized workforce with IT limitations or internet limitations, and a completely different way of communicating. Really important that we keep our students engaged during this process if we can, also to keep them well informed of our progress. And I think it's really important that with our communication, it's clear, concise, and consistent. There's nothing worse, and I've heard some stories from people in the industry about students in the vet sector who haven't heard a single word, not even an email, from their providers in the last couple of months. And that's certainly not what we want to be doing. We will also want to make sure, as I mentioned before, that our staff are well supported, because they are ultimately supporting our students. The regulators are trying to support us, and the Victorian government, the Victorian Department of Education, is doing a lot to communicate with providers and to support them with some of the compliance flexibilities, which we'll look at shortly. And it's really important that you stay abreast of those updates. Moving into the online delivery side of things, and I could talk for probably 4 or 5 hours on this, but unfortunately I've only got 10 minutes to cover off this topic. And I'm sure many of you are already adopting technology and trying madly to convert traditional paper-based or face-to-face classroom content and activities into some form of engaging online content. First thing I'll say for skills first providers is make sure that your qualification or your training product that you're trying to move into an online environment is not a part of the online delivery restriction list. So obviously these qualifications up here cannot be delivered wholly online. Under the contract, we also need to have an online service standard. So this is where any training or assessment is delivered online. We need to have that policy document, and it needs to be published on our website or publicly available. So we need to include in this document, we need to identify the support mechanisms in place for students engaging in an online environment. We need to identify learning materials, student engagement practices, entry requirements and induction. So specifically, this would form part of the PTR with respect to digital capability, mode and method of assessments utilised, and details of the trainer and assessor skills and experience who will be participating in that online delivery. So it's not just a case of turning a Word document into some online content. We do need to consider other parts of the contract, including the pre-training review, the online service standards, and other aspects as well. There was a point on that previous slide about the trainer professional development. And when you implement online engagement under a funded qualification, you do need to implement a professional development program for the trainers and assessors who will be engaging in those online activities. Okay, so they need to have the ability to use contemporary technology, so you need to support them with the technology that you're implementing. Need to be able to facilitate and communicate effectively in that online environment, which is a skill in itself. And we need to make sure that our trainers can ensure students maintain that motivation and engagement through the course as well. Okay, so that is separate to your standard trainer PD requirements. This is specifically a clause in the contract that's talking about PD associated with online delivery. Now, the Department of Education has released a contract notification some time ago offering compliance flexibility during the COVID period. So this is one of those ways that the department is supporting RTOs. The contract, if you look at the contract, we do have to have an online service standards policy. We do need to have that on our website. What you can do right now is you can engage in online learning without the presence of an online service standards policy. So that is something that the department will allow. But what they do expect in return is that you are working towards producing one, and that you're prioritizing providing practical information to students, and you're ensuring that those trainers and assessors are equipped to engage online. So for example, if we are a face-to-face traditional style delivery model for one of our programs, and we want to move 20% of our content online, we would need to start working on that online service standards document. We would need to perhaps implement some IT solutions into our business, and we would then need to put our trainers and assessors through some kind of formal training to ensure that they have the skills and knowledge necessary to support the cohorts who will be then expected to adopt that technology. Just a quick note on training and assessment strategies. So many of your TAS documents would have been built pre-COVID, or not necessarily with a pandemic in mind. And so it's probably worth taking a look at those to see if we need to perhaps update some of the information in them, whether that's the entry requirements, where you've got an expectation that students enrolling into that program have a computer or have reliable internet or can access a learner portal. We want to be able to make sure that we've got learner progress monitoring arrangements, validation as well for online assessment tools is really critical too. So it's probably worth reviewing those documents. Now's a great time to do it, especially in the lead up to that contract application as well for next year. Moving on to enrolments, and this is one of the most interesting areas for us, because there's a lot of opportunities here to take the enrolment process into the cloud, and many providers may not be aware of some of those possibilities. So if we look at streamlining skills first at an enrolment level, and what we want to talk about briefly today is the pre-training review, determination of eligibility, collecting evidence of concession and eligibility, completing that enrolment form, and then issuing a statement of fees and training plan at the end of it. And believe it or not, all of that can be done without physically seeing the student. Now, it may not be an ideal outcome for your cohorts, depending on what type of organisation you are, what type of cohorts you have. Nothing beats a face-to-face engagement. But a process that is purely online or electronic allows us, or gives us, that flexibility to react to situations like this. Or if a student's sick and they can't come in for a face-to-face session down the track, then we do have those systems in place to be able to undertake a PTR or enrolment process remotely. So if we look at the pre-training review, it can be conducted remotely, as I said. There is additional information, if you're not already documenting it, that you would need to include as part of that suitability determination, and that would be digital capability. So if you think about an LLM testing a student's literacy and numeracy, we would probably want to gauge a student's digital capability to ensure that they can actually successfully log into a student portal. We also need to make sure they've got access to necessary technology. If we have programs that require a certain operating system on our computer, or if we require regular internet access to attend Zoom sessions or face-to-face online classrooms, then we need to make sure that those students are well supported. And if they're not, we need to make sure we've got processes in place or support mechanisms to overcome those barriers. And just a note on that, that is something that you would obviously collect that information as part of a pre-training review. The department would also like you to ensure that existing students who, say, enrolled 6 months ago under a face-to-face arrangement you're also having a conversation with them about whether or not they have the digital capabilities and access to technology to successfully participate in those programs, because we are being very reactive at the moment, and we are taking traditional content, PDF or Word document content, and moving it online. So we need to make sure that our current students are just as well supported as those new incoming students. Electronic paperwork, so what we're talking about here is being able to complete all of that paperwork in an online environment. So that's the pre-training review documentation, the determination of eligibility, the eligibility form, and any other documentation associated with enrolment. Okay, so we would recommend taking a close look at a digital agreement management software. So that would be something like an Adobe or a DocuSign or a HelloSign, where you can take that pro forma and put it online and have students and RTO delegates participate in an online two-way conversation. Okay, so one example of how you might do that is by having your eligibility form directly uploaded into one of these types of programs. And you can see here on the screen that an RTO delegate is completing the eligibility form for a student. When you hover your cursor over those text boxes, you'll see the required field. And that's a series of validation rules that have been applied to make sure that the form is filled in correctly. So what we're doing here is we're allowing students and RTO delegates to complete the form online. It complies with the contract, but we're also inserting validation rules to make sure that the form is filled in correctly. So students can't tick 2 boxes or 3 boxes, they can only tick 1 box, and it reduces the error rate on the completion of this documentation. So I think that's a great example of what you could do online. And the same applies for all of your pre-training review documentation, even your LLN and other components of the enrolment process. The document verification service is the missing link to that previous video that I showed you before. So it's great to be able to fill in the eligibility form online, but we also need to be able to cite evidence of eligibility. And as we all know, most of us are probably quite accustomed to physically taking that piece of ID, whether it's a Medicare card or a driver's license, and photocopying it or scanning it and storing it away in a student file. The document verification service is a national online system that allows us to electronically verify ID, very similar to how an online police check would work. What you'd need to do is you would need to engage a gateway service provider, which is a company approved by the Commonwealth to set their database up to access national records. And then what you can do is plug in the details of that student's Medicare card and have it verified directly in an online environment. Okay, so you can see here, we're typing in a passport number for a student, putting in their details, and then we're clicking verify. It automatically looks up the record in our national databases, and it downloads a certificate for you. So that certificate is all you need to store against the student file to comply with the determination, to comply with the citing of eligibility evidence. Okay, so in the contract, there is a whole series of clauses around document verification, and we have many providers that have already adopted this type of solution. And again, it just gives us that additional flexibility, even if it is our long-term intention to conduct PTR sessions face-to-face. This is still a fantastic solution because it future-proofs us for the coming years. So even if we've got a student sitting in front of us, it's going to be a much easier process to take that ID, put it into the DVS, and then verify it and download a PDF report. We haven't printed a single piece of paper, we haven't used a scanner, and in situations where the student may not be able to attend, or they've attended a PTR but they didn't bring their ID with them, we can actually just use a photo or an image that's emailed through to us, plug in the details, and put it through the DVS. Just briefly talking about student management systems. There's a range of people on this webinar this morning, and everyone's using a different system. Regardless of what system you're using, it's really important that your student management system gives you the opportunity to create online enrollment forms that integrate with your system. It really should have the capability to generate templates that can be sent out from the system directly. So again, this is the ability to take a student record and print a training plan from your student management system, a training plan that can then be sent through some piece of online software to obtain electronic signatures. Workflows are also a fantastic option as well as part of that student management system. So the ability to automate a lot of these processes or notify people as well, I think is a fantastic solution. So it might be worth, after this, just taking a closer look at your student management system, because it's a sunk cost that we need to invest in for data reporting. But a lot of these systems have all of this functionality available at your fingertips. Going back to that contract notification that was sent out earlier this year by the department, there are some more compliance flexibility arrangements too. So the department has recognised that this is a very difficult time, and it is very difficult to physically see people and collect ID. They have allowed some temporary measures here where you are allowed to cite and retain uncertified copies of eligibility. So they are allowing you to collect a scan or a photo of the original document via email, but that is a temporary solution, something that they would certainly want you to be working towards a more rigorous process. And for us, that's where the DVS comes in. That's a fantastic solution. You can also cite electronic copies of concession cards as well, in the same way that you would cite the citizenship evidence. Moving on to student progress. So we're talking about engagement and evidence of participation, which is one of everyone's favourite topics. So when implementing online engagement, particularly if you're an organisation that has traditionally focused on face-to-face engagement, we need to ask a couple of questions. One is, how will our content need to be changed to adapt to the online environment? Understanding that we've had to be very reactionary during this period, and I know a lot of providers have taken their existing content, their theory-based workbooks or learner books and activities, and they've sent them out in the post to students to continue engaging in those activities. But what we're talking about here with online content is engaging interactive content that isn't paper-based. You need to ask yourself, how will your trainers need to be supported to ensure effective training delivery? So this goes back to the contract requirements around professional development for online delivery and assessment, and also the mental health considerations as well. A lot of traditional trainers are now being thrown into an online world where they perhaps don't have that experience or confidence. And I know for a fact that there are a lot of trainers out there who are really struggling with coming to terms with some of the IT systems that RTOs are implementing at an extremely rapid pace. So I think it's really important that we support our trainers, because again, they are at the front line of our student engagement and they have the relationships with the students. So we need to make sure that they're well supported. We need to consider what type of platforms and IT systems we may already have or may need to implement to effectively implement that engagement strategy. And also consider how we may have documented our online service standards and some of those other contractual requirements I mentioned before. Not to mention the EVETMIS data reporting for online delivery and assessment, and we'll talk about that briefly quite shortly. So looking at learning management systems, which would be the platform that you use to engage with your cohorts. And just on that previous slide there, I just want to show you an example of online content. So you can see here we have a PDF document, which is a learner guide for a particular unit of competency. And this learner guide is paper-based, obviously. It has areas where students can complete notes or activities. And a lot of RTOs have initially reacted by pushing this out to their students through the post as a printed PDF, which is a great way to continue that engagement, but not a great long-term solution if you want to look at adopting online engagement in a more permanent basis. So this document, I've got an example of how this document might be displayed in an LMS system as well. Okay, so you can see here that we have logged into a student portal, and the student can see that document there, and then they can launch this document. So the content that you see here is exactly the same content that you saw on that PDF document, except here it's presented in an online platform in a more engaging way. We have activities here for the students to complete. They can jump around to different parts of the platform, different parts of the content, lots of activities embedded throughout that document to ensure that the student maintains a decent level of engagement. And so this is the difference between, say, a PDF document, which I understand that it is something that as a reactionary process just has to be sent out, perhaps to continue engagement. But this is an example of what you could potentially do down the track in a more long-term setting. Because I think if we take the silver lining approach here and we look at COVID, we can start to see the opportunities that present our organisations to be able to perhaps streamline or move some of our face-to-face stuff into a more blended model as well. And understanding that that doesn't necessarily work for all cohorts or all programs, but certainly something that should be looked at very carefully. So in order to have a platform in order to be able to engage with a student in that type of manner, we probably need to have some kind of LMS, learning management system. Now, some student management systems are an LMS as well. So you need to take a close look at the system that you've got, because if you've got a platform that does both, then one solution one IT solution is obviously going to be a better option than implementing another IT platform that you then have to learn, train staff, and support staff and students with. So if you can get everything into the one house, then that's going to be fantastic for you. So you need to consider things like the learner experience, the visuals of the learning management system. You saw in that previous example that there was lots of color, it was a very simple interface for the student to navigate. And we also need to consider costs and how our staff will be supported to then support students as well. We take a look at evidence of participation, and there's a couple of points here so that you're obviously all very familiar with: attendance, online learning, and a comment about the sending theory books to students. So with attendance, regardless of how we collect attendance, we still need to satisfy the contractual requirements. So in a classroom, we might take a piece of paper and get students to sign against their name, and then the trainer would sign that piece of paper and send it through to admin for data processing. If you have an electronic process for collecting attendance, then you still need to satisfy those requirements, and you still need a trainer signature. Now, a trainer signature by definition under the contract does not need to be an actual signature on a piece of paper. It can be an electronic action, provided it meets the principles under the guidelines from the department. So it is possible to collect attendance remotely. Trainers sitting at home, engaging with students in an online setting, can actually record their own attendance as a roll call. So there is a myth that you need to have students sign an attendance sheet. That is not true. Under the contract, students do not need to sign an attendance sheet. What you need is the trainer to record attendance at a minimum and sign off with their signature, whether that's an actual signature or an electronic action. So I think that's really important to note, because there are still many providers out there who aren't aware of that opportunity. So then that gives us the opportunity to take attendance and have it as a trainer-driven process, which can be done from anywhere. Online learning activity. So this is learning activities like that online engagement, online e-learning module that I showed you before. It's assessment activity, and we need to make sure that we have audit logs to track that activity as well. And I just want to make a quick note again about the sending theory books home to students. It's a great stopgap measure, but this is not necessarily going to satisfy EOP requirements. Yes, the student might be engaging in that content remotely, but we have no way of tracking that. And if you look at the contract, we really need to have what we call two-way communication evidence. So for example, any of the providers out there who are sending out theory books home to students to keep them engaged, because your organization may not be in a position to adopt technology quickly or anything like that, or your cohorts may not be able to access online resources, then you need to implement a two-way communication evidence process to support that. So when you send out those theory booklets to students, it would be wise to then get the Skills First teachers to contact the students and to discuss those theory booklets on a regular basis. Those teachers would then document that conversation, whether it's an email chain or a phone call, as a file note against the student record. That forms the final piece of your evidence of participation with respect to theory books being sent home. Other examples of evidence of participation in an online setting would include, I mentioned the Skills First teacher notes, Zoom recordings as well. You can record online sessions, whether you're using Zoom or Google Meets or something else, attendance records from online sessions, online quizzes, and e-learning content logs. So as another example, I logged in and as a student before, and I launched that e-learning module for a unit of competency. And what you can see here is an audit trail of every single login point, the date and time, and the duration that that person spent in the system. So that's minutes and seconds and microseconds. And then it calculates the total time of engagement online. So this is a great example of how you could track engagement in that online learning activity in a student management system. Okay, so moving back to the slides, really important that you have ways that you can document the engagement. This is a really important part of the contract, particularly with the way that we're all reacting to the current situation in Victoria. I think this is something that we might focus on in more detail at a later stage. And then finally, data and cash flow. So with the data reporting, we need to be aware of the process for reporting through SVTS our interrupted training. And we also need to be able to report changing delivery modes. And then I just want to touch briefly on the C19 schedule identifier, which is an opportunity presented by the department for providers to restructure the payment logic against units of competency to protect our cash flow. So reporting interrupted training is critical. And this is in situations where a student cannot engage in training. So this is where you don't have any alternative but to report the training in this manner. Now that could be because the student is an apprentice and they need to demonstrate practical skills on, if they're doing hairdressing on a live model, or if they're working in another industry but they can't actually go to work. And there's no more theory content to engage with that student, perhaps this is an interrupted training scenario. So we do need to report the final outcomes that apply to completed units. We need to report a 70 code or a continuing activity status or a 79 for any of those units that are still in progress, including units where supervised training and assessment has finished, but the required practical placement component of the training package is still yet to be completed. And this will affect a lot of the people in this webinar today. I know there's a lot of you out there who are struggling with those types of programs, whether it's individual support or aging support, or some other program where students need to participate in practical placement. You should look at extending end dates to either the best estimate of when you think that might finish, and I understand that is extremely difficult to do with COVID, or what you can do is extend to the next month, at which point you would need to extend again. And then you should also report your program status identifier as a 42 code, withdrawn deferred. And that's in situations where it's interrupted training. So we're not talking about students who are still engaging through working at home or participating in online content or other means. We're talking about completely interrupted training. In terms of withdrawals, another massive part of the contract and something we can look at going into more detail at another stage. Make sure that you're withdrawing students and reporting them correctly in line with those fact sheets as well. Reporting delivery is really important because a lot of our organisations are changing the way that we engage with students, and we need to make sure that we've updated our student management system records to report our delivery modes and locations correctly. So delivery mode identifier E, external, is referring to online engagement. So if you are taking a face-to-face unit and then adding a component of online engagement, we do need to add the E flag to our NAT 120 file in order to report that successfully. Okay, so this is for units of competency where the student doesn't attend a physical location. We want to look down the track at updating our training and assessment strategies, as I mentioned before. We perhaps want to issue an updated training plan that reflects the new delivery modes and assessment modes, if relevant. And then for apprentices and trainees, for those providers who work in those spaces, you know that you have to have the training plan endorsed by the relevant parties. The Department of Education is allowing a temporary reprieve for that. And so you can just have an email exchange or a file note documenting a phone call where you've confirmed that with the apprentice or trainee. We need to look at the predominant delivery mode. So it's one thing to report that we're delivering some face-to-face, because we may have done that pre-COVID, and online, but we need to make sure we report the predominant delivery mode. So that's the delivery mode that we use the most. So if a student did 90% of their course face-to-face and the last 10% was done remotely, the predominant delivery mode would be I for internal, because the majority of that training was conducted in a face-to-face environment. If the unit only just started and you're moving the majority of it online, we need to set the predominant delivery mode to E. It's really important that if we do that, that we update our training delivery location to the location where training is being coordinated. So in examples where we're enrolling new, fresh student enrollments at a unit level into online training, our delivery location should actually be our head office or our main campus. And it's really important to note, particularly for providers operating in regional settings, that once you do that, you will lose your regional subsidy loading, that 1.1 loading, which is based on the postcode of the delivery location. So just keep that in mind, that you will lose that 1.1 loading when you make that change to the predominant delivery mode. Just very quickly, because I know we're getting close to the 45-minute mark, just want to make a quick note about centralized and decentralized data management. In a traditional training provider with paper-based systems, we typically employ a centralized data management system. And what I mean by that is data management, or the processing of student paperwork, evidence of participation, anything to do with the student, and then the reporting, is actually managed from an office in a physical location in one central location. Obviously, we've now got a decentralized workforce, so no one is potentially in the office at all. And this type of system becomes extremely difficult, obviously, with a decentralized workforce. Web-based software is the solution for continuing a centralized data management system during this period. And not only that, but it would also future-proof your RTO for the future. So examples of centralized data management. Some of you are already doing this at the moment. Recording file notes against an electronic student record. So creating a note against the student file in your student management system, which is recorded by the Skills First teacher and has a timestamp attached to it. That is what I would consider a decentralized data management mimicking a centralized management system. So another option is to convert all of your pro forma, which we discussed before, into online or electronic forms. Having an electronic enrollment, having an electronic statement of fees presented to the student, enrollment confirmation letters, training plans, attendance records, withdrawal forms, anything associated with Skills First compliance, all of that documentation you should be able to put that into an online environment. And we do have organizations now that are, if you look at them sort of 6 to 8 months ago, they were completely paper-based, and they are now 100% in the cloud, and they don't even use a single bit of paper for the purposes of processing administrative forms like these. Cash flow is obviously a huge issue for the sector at the moment, particularly as we know with the SVTS payment logic. When we extend end dates on units of competency, the SVTS logic reapportions that money across the new range from start date to end date. The C19 purchasing contract schedule identifier was a fantastic initiative by the department, and it basically allowed you to assign that code to an individual unit of competency, and it would ignore the payment logic and it would treat it like it used to, where you would keep the money that you'd already been paid for that unit of competency, and then it would just reapportion the remaining amount out. So I think that's a fantastic initiative, and certainly something that you should all strongly consider adopting or taking advantage of if you haven't already. Again, we could talk a lot about how to treat this. Each student management system will have a different way of recording this information, and I think it's really important that you get that right. So perhaps we can do another session on this as well. I think I've created 3 more webinars out of this already. So what's next? Definitely go back and review your engagement strategy, or create one if you don't have one. Even if that's just a couple of sentences on a page, I think it's really important that providers document the way that they plan on engaging with students, the way they plan on engaging with their workforce in the remote setting, and the way that they plan on supporting all of the different stakeholders across the business during this time. Have a look at your pre-existing technology. Have a look at your student management system. Have a look at your learning management system and any other piece of software that you've got in your business to see whether or not you're actually maximizing its use and whether you can take that to the next level, because that'll be a more cost-effective measure than perhaps going out and purchasing a whole bunch of bolt-ons to an existing system. Make sure you document everything: teacher notes, phone calls, emails, Zoom sessions. Really important. There is a lot of compliance flexibility, and the department understands the challenges faced by providers, but it will help us sleep at night if we just make sure that we document all of that engagement evidence in the correct manner. I would recommend having a read through the contract notifications that have been released over the last 6 months. There's a lot of documentation on SVTS in the last 6 months. Strongly recommend that you go through all of it to see where you can perhaps take advantage of that departmental support, because I think it's really important, if they're putting that on offer, that we take advantage of it so that we can get through these next couple of months in particular. Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. As I said before, I'm absolutely blown away by how many people showed interest in this. And I think that based on that, we'll probably do a few more of these types of webinars, because there's certainly a need for that additional support. If there's questions that you might have had that you were expecting us to cover off and we haven't answered them, I would encourage you to submit your question to info@RTOlogic, and we'll endeavour to get a response to you as soon as we can. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and all the best.